Okay, well, a very warm welcome on behalf both of the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees, and for myself, Monica Boehm, the initiator and director of the Insiders Outsiders project, which many of you will know something about. This event, which promises to be absolutely fascinating, thought-provoking, intense, is the first of a series of events that I have helped put together, or I have made happen in a sense, to mark this year's Refugee Week. And of course, it's entirely appropriate that we start off with this particular extraordinary work of, well, not exactly fiction, but a novel, let us call it. So I think without further ado, I've gone through already the practicalities, and I will also just say, if I may, that the event will be recorded as well. So for those of you who wish to watch it again, tell your friends about it, it will be uploaded later onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel and also the AJR's YouTube channel as well. Fine, so yes, a book that has done remarkably well. We have the publisher here, we have the translator, we have Eva Hoffman, who probably needs very little introduction, and the event will be very ably hosted, if past events are anything to go by my friend and colleague David Herman, who will in fact take over in a minute. But I'll just say, as a sort of extra plug to this extraordinary book with an extraordinary history, that Adam was just telling us, much to his delight and to my delight as well, that it's now number 8, am I right, Adam, in the Sunday Times bestseller list, the top 10 bestseller list. It's also had rave reviews from all sorts of unlikely places, including the Daily Mail, you know, at one end of the spectrum, the Guardian at the other. And I think last week, if I'm right, actually won the accolade of being the best-selling hardback at Waterstones. So extraordinary in a way, but also perhaps not entirely surprising. But I will say no more and now hand over to David. David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Monica, and welcome everybody. The Passenger, as Monica was saying, has been one of the surprise hits of the year. A terrific novel about a German Jew fleeing for his life in pre-war Nazi Germany, which has, as Monica says, has crashed into the Sunday Times bestseller list, and yesterday was on the Guardian's hottest books for the summer. It was first published in German in 1938 and translated into English in 1940. It then sort of vanished without trace and was rediscovered by the German publisher and editor Peter Graf and republished in German in 2018. Pushkin Press have now translated it with an excellent preface by André Assermann and a fascinating afterword by Peter Graf and a wonderful translation by Philip Boehm. To discuss what makes The Passenger such a compelling read, I'm joined from Houston, Texas, by the book's translator, Philip Boehm, an American playwright, theatre director, and literary translator. Philip has translated over 30 novels and plays by German and Polish writers, including Herta Müller, Franz Kafka, and Hannah Krall. His translations include A Woman in Berlin and Words to Outlive Us, Eyewitness Accounts from the Warsaw Ghetto, and the acclaimed new translation of Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. We're also joined by the book's publisher, Adam Freudenheim, managing director of Pushkin Press. Previously, he was publisher of Penguin Classics, Modern Classics, and Reference. And Adam joined Pushkin in May 2012 and brought his passion for international literature and exquisitely designed books to Pushkin. And some of my favorite, just to give them a quick plug, some of my favorite recent Pushkin Press titles, apart from The Passenger, include Gabriela Terget's Käsebier Takes Berlin, Joseph Roth's Book of Stories, The Coral Merchant, and the collected novellas of Stefan Zweig, just published in May. And we're joined by the writer and critic Eva Hoffman, author of novels, plays, works of non-fiction, including Lost in Translation, Exit into History, A Journey Through the New Eastern Europe, Shtetl, The Life and Death of a Small Town and the World of Polish Jews, and After Such Knowledge, Memory, History, and the Legacy of the Holocaust. The discussion will run till about 6:45, and then there'll be time for questions and answers from the audience, and we hope to finish around 7:15. Adam, can you tell us a little bit about who the author was? Ulrich Alexander Boschwitz, not yet a household name, or fast becoming one, but who was?
Absolutely. I mean, you've touched a bit on him, but he was born in 1915 in Berlin and had a Jewish father, but a non-Jewish mother. And he left Germany in 1935 after the Nuremberg laws with his mother and went to, I think, Norway and then Sweden, or Sweden and then Norway. I can't remember Philip might remember which order it's in, but what does it do?
Back and forth, but I think it was Sweden and Norway. But
and then at the age of only 23, really struck by what he was reading and hearing about the events of Kristallnacht, immediately in 4 weeks, from what we understand, wrote the novel that we now know as The Passenger. It was, as you said, actually it was published in 1939 in the US, and then in 1940 in the UK under different titles, and then kind of disappeared without a trace until being rediscovered, as you said, by Peter Graf. And it's also worth noting that Boschwitz, rather sadly, then he and his mother, they came to the UK when, after the war started, like many, they were interned as enemy aliens because they were considered Germans. Obviously, they were Germans, though they were, in part Jewish, or Jewish from the German point of view. And they went to Australia. And when, unfortunately, then they chose to come back on a ship in 1942 that was then torpedoed by a German U-boat, and all 300 plus passengers on board died, including Ulrich Boschwitz. So that's a brief kind of encapsulation of his life. I don't know if Philip wants to add anything there that I may have.
He was shipped off to Australia. I'm not sure his mother was, but he was shipped off and interned in Australia in what amounted to a prisoner camp. I mean, along with prisoners of war, and these refugees at the time were treated very roughly on that passage on the Dunera, and then later in Australia. And at this same time, he was revising this manuscript. He was in contact with his mother and sending her letters. An earlier book had been published in Swedish, I think, but he knew that this book required some revision, and I think what Peter Graf did was discover some of these, a couple letters to his mother. He had evidently sent some revisions from Australia to his mother, but they didn't make it. And then he was working on another manuscript when he was aboard the Abasso, which is the ship that was torpedoed in 1942. So really the rediscovery of it is rather remarkable, and I believe that's also by chance that Peter Graf was in Israel giving an interview with Haaretz, and the niece of Ulrich Boschwitz, because there had been a sister who had immigrated to Palestine after the Nuremberg laws were passed. This niece said, "Hey, my uncle has this book. You might be interested." And Peter Graf describes his discovery of that manuscript and reading it feverishly in an archive in Germany. So that's an interesting addition, perhaps.
Yes, it's only a chance. It's amazing. It's only by chance that he discovered it, as you say.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And Adam, how did you come across it? What made you decide to publish it?
How I came across it is not that interesting a story in a way. It's a pretty typical publishing story. After it was, when it was being published in Germany, I should say, I was sent it by, the German publisher, who thought I would be interested in it because of Alone in Berlin, really, which I had published when I was at Penguin, Hans Fallada's 1947 novel that was rediscovered and published in English for the first time in 2009. And I read it immediately on the day I received it, and was the first foreign publisher to offer on it. And then it was bought in America by Metropolitan Books and by a wonderful editor there, Sarah Burchtel. And then it was sold in many, I think it's now 20 languages at least, that it then sold around the world, something in that sort. And why I chose to publish it, that's what we're going to talk about, but I suppose in a nutshell, like everyone, or so many people, and certainly I suspect the people attending this event, it's an endlessly fascinating period, of course. And it's particularly interesting to read books from this period rather than books that are, looking back. And there's lots of historical fiction about it. And I think what's extraordinary about this book is that it was written in immediate response to the events. And even though Ulrich Boschwitz himself didn't experience, as I said, he was very close to it in so many other ways. And I've never read a novel like this, that's kind of written in the wake of, really historic, momentous events, and captures so much of what was going on there. And as I've mentioned elsewhere, I guess from a personal perspective, my father was born in Germany in 1937, and he was lucky enough to emigrate in 1938, a few months before the events of Kristallnacht. So I feel very close to all of this because of my family connection to it. So yeah, that's the short answer.
And you're one of the, as the translator, you're one of the unsung heroes of this incredible revival we're going through at the moment of particularly German language, but not only German language fiction. And I was just wondering if there's were any particular challenges in the translating of it, or?
Well, there are always challenges to a translation, and I should do another shout out to Sarah Burstel, because of course I'm from the US and I'm translating in my idiom. And here, incidentally, is our version of the book looks a little different.
Yeah, we can have a comparison on screen.
Yeah, right. It's Sarah had published a number of works also from this period, and I think also has the same fascination. A Woman in Berlin, for instance, was also a diary from the time, and I think the interest that she had was very similar to yours, Adam, and just finding this voice. As for the challenges to translate, there's always a balancing act. We want to include enough of the local time and place without burdening the reader, and then the distances differ. The distance between a Polish book and English translation is slightly longer than, it's farther away than a German book. So there's a certain amount of German sounding names and words that we can kind of absorb as we read, whereas Slavic names are notoriously difficult. I mean, just all the commentators on Dostoevsky novels. I mean, that's the kind of joke. But here, the other was finding the time period. What words might ring false because they're too much today, and yet you want to get a little bit of that there's a filmic quality. If you're asked this, you're going to set it, and you're going to have Bogart in one role, and you're going to and so you want a little bit of that hard boiledness to it. I was fortunate; my father was still alive when I was translating this, and I had an easy reference because I could ask him. I could say, "Well, you were around then. Is this a kind of phrase you would use? Is this sound?" And he said, "Yeah, well, we would say that." And so I had that check. But that is one that was one difficulty. How do you deal with the German formal you and informal you, and also that has changed over the years a little bit. So trying to insinuate some of that first name basis and that familiarity, and it comes up, but that's a constant problem translating from a number of languages. So, but I think the real trick here, there's an energy in the book, and there's a speed, and there is a propulsion. He's on these trains, and so we want to get that sense of motion. And I think that is embedded in the rhythm of the language in the original. And I'm hoping that I was able to capture at least some of that forward movement in the translation.
And let's do it now. Where and when, let's start talking about the novel itself now, and where and when is the novel set?
Is that to Eva?
Sorry, to Eva, I beg your pardon.
Oh, it's to me.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think the novel is set in medias res. It is set in 1938, right after Kristallnacht, as far as I can tell. So it's very much in medias res, and there is a real sense that of immediacy. He is responding to the moment in a way which is very prescient as well, which is extremely prescient. I mean, it's really very striking. In fact, I wanted to ask a few things about that, but I also want to say that yes, there is an enormous sense of propulsion, and at the same time of this going in circles.
Mm-hmm.
He is on the move, on the move, on the move, and going nowhere.
Yeah.
So yes. So that's it's set then. I mean, I could say more. I mean, the sense of immediacy is very striking. The sense of propulsion is very striking. To me, what's perhaps most striking about it is the psychological insight. I mean, it's a depiction of states of anxiety, which is, really very brilliant. And states of anxiety, in which he talks to himself. I mean, most of the novel is written through internal dialogue with himself. So, he is becoming more and more divided. He is trying to hold on to his identity, but he's becoming more and more divided. He doesn't know how to, he's completely uncertain about the situation. And as his collective identity, so to speak, as his social identity is being challenged, as he's being stripped of it ruthlessly, his money is being extorted. He knows that he can be he is being excluded from many places. I mean, he is being stripped of his identity. And so, and he's trying to hold on to his sanity. But as his social identity, I think the interaction, the sort of the interface about his social identity, between his social identity, his collective identity, and his inner identity, his self, is, very brilliantly depicted.
And one thing, Adam, that struck me about the central character, Otto Silbermann, is that he's not a completely sympathetic character. Of course, he's in a terrible, terrible situation, almost from the very beginning of the novel. And so one sympathizes with him. And yet, there's another sort of side to his personality, it seems.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that's one of the most fascinating and interesting aspects of the book. He's human, all too human, absolutely. And you kind of you have this real sense, in lots of ways, you put it quite politely, in lots of ways he's quite unlikable, let's be honest. And certainly at the beginning, you don't really like him. As you say, you sympathize with his plight, but you don't particularly like him and his attitudes and how he's depicted. And I really like that. I think it's a huge strength of the novel. Rather than making him this saintly martyr and victim, he's much more complicated than that. And I think that probably also, it's worth touching, I think, in this context, on the way that he maybe reflects some of Boschwitz's own kind of family background, which I touched on. The fact that Otto Silbermann is married to someone non-Jewish. He's Jewish, but there's so many aspects in the novel. His name is Jewish, but he obviously doesn't look Jewish, we're told, whatever that means. And I do think one of the most, Eva referred to some of how the prescience of the novel, and I think it's extraordinary. Just to give one example, the scene where there's the conversation about how someone's saying it's so hard to recognize Jews. It's so hard to tell that they're Jewish. If only they were wearing, a yellow star. And I think that's kind of extraordinary in writing that at the end of 1938, and it gives you chills. But yes, absolutely. For me, that complexity of Silbermann as a character and his unlikability in many ways makes him just a much more human character and makes the novel far more fascinating. And as Eva was saying, you're in his head and you get much more of a sense of how conflicted he is. And I suspect that, again, in a wider sense, stepping back, it feels to me like a lot of German Jews were very conflicted as well, and that's, not surprisingly, they felt so much a part of Germany and of German culture. And then they found that they weren't really.
And Philip, just to give us a sort of flavour of this kind of psychological feel of the novel, you're going to read us just a short extract very early on.
It's a very short passage from, it's from the first pages, and he has just seen his business partner, and this was a partner that was forced on him. It was one of his employees, but he had to make him a partner because he could no longer technically be in charge of his business. Anyway, he's just seen this man off at the train station, and he is going to head home. This is from the very beginning of the book. After leaving the train station, he climbed into a taxi and headed home. The streets were full of people, many in uniform. Newsboys were hawking their papers, and Silbermann had the impression they were doing a brisk business. For a moment he considered buying one for himself, but then decided against it since he figured the news was bound to be bad and almost certainly hostile, at least as far as he was concerned. He would undoubtedly be experiencing it all firsthand soon enough. After a short ride, the taxi pulled up in front of his building. Frau Friedrichs, the wife of the concierge, was lingering in the stairwell. She greeted him politely, and Silbermann was somehow glad to see that her behavior remained unchanged. As he stepped onto the red plush runner and climbed the stairs, he once again had the sensation that his life was only half real. Recently, such ruminations had become a habit. I'm living as though I weren't a Jew, he thought, somewhat incredulously. For the time being, I'm simply a well-to-do citizen, under threat, it's true, but as of yet unscathed. How is this possible? I live in a modern 6-room apartment. People talk to me and treat me as though I were one of them. They act as if I'm the same person I used to be, the liars. It's enough to give a man a guilty conscience. Whereas I'd like to show them a clearer picture of reality, namely that, as of yesterday, I'm something different because I am a Jew. And who did I used to be? No, who am I? What am I really? A swear word on 2 legs, one that people mistake for something else. I no longer have any rights, and it's only out of propriety or habit that so many act as though I did. My entire existence is based solely on the faulty memory of people who essentially wish to destroy it. They just happen to have forgotten about me. I've been officially degraded, but the public debasement has yet to take place.
And Eva, one of the striking things about that passage is that the prose is incredibly clear. For a German interwar novel, it's not hard, it's not difficult to get into. Right from the very beginning, you're absolutely drawn into the book, and it's a very clear and easy read, wouldn't you say?
You're directing this question to me.
Sorry, yes, Eva, sorry.
I'm sorry. Yes, absolutely. Well, it reads like a thriller. And I don't know, he apparently assumed this pseudonym, John Grain, for one of his books, for one of his previous books. And that sounds very American to me. And I wonder if he was thinking of American thrillers, I don't know which exactly, because it's not literature I read, but I wonder if he was thinking about that. or even about American films, American suspense films. So yes, it is. But also, I wonder if this was, in a sense, the virtue of necessity. I mean, he was writing it very quickly. And I wonder if that perhaps enforced a certain kind of simplicity of style, a certain kind of clarity of style. But there is, a great simplicity of style and a considerable complexity of perception, I think. And, to my mind, particularly psychological perception, as well as social perception. I mean, one does keep thinking of Kafka, and there is an allusion to Kafka. But one really does keep thinking of metamorphosis, and the trial, and the opening sentence of the trial, somebody must have traduced Joseph K. Yes, what has happened? I am now, in a sense, betrayed, traduced by everybody.
You use the word betrayed, which I think is absolutely right. But one of the other questions which goes against, on the one hand, you have the simplicity of the writing, Adam, but on the other hand, you also have this sense, the psychological complexity in the sense of who can you trust and who can trust him. So it sort of seems to work on two layers.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, throughout the novel, you've got this traveling by train, but also traveling, trying to kind of have different people who might help him along the way, or kind of people he encounters. And as you say, who can he trust and how can he trust them? And it's not really entirely clear. I thought one thing I wanted to come back to on the kind of depiction of him, the sort of not entirely flattering depiction, which I also find really interesting, is, and I'd be interested in Philip and Eva's views on this too, but in a sense, he's quite a kind of stereotypically money-grubbing figure, and I find that a kind of really interesting that he chose to, the way that Boschwitz chose to do that, because it's quite, it's not crude, but it's somehow effective at the same time, because you do understand why, because obviously part of why he's running, and he's got his suitcase with his money, and he's, cares so much about his money and negotiating with his partner in name, etc. And I found all of that really fascinating, and again, kind of goes against the grain for, what you expect, in a way, that he's kind of writing to those stereotypes in an interesting way. I don't know whether what Philip and Eva felt about that.
Well, I mean, I think, that in a way, this is a pretty specific portrait of a person who belongs to a certain class. He is a well-to-do Jewish person. He's a Jewish businessman. So money means a lot to him, although it is true that, this motif of, money is life, becomes quite troubling. And, I don't know what else one can say, but it is, I mean, he's, the other interesting thing about the novel is that it is a cross-section of German society. I mean, there are people from various classes that he encounters on his travels, but also a kind of cross-section of Jewish society and various attitudes and various, positions in life. The less well-off, the better well-off, the envy between them. So yeah, I mean, it is not a sentimental book at all. I mean, I don't know what else can be said. It is a troubling motif, I must say. I found it troubling, this motif of money is life, money is life.
I think that there's another background to that, because if we remember what had been happening in Germany just in the years prior to this, the it comes up occasionally in these conversations he has with the people in the train compartment. The leftist parties were very, very vocal, and there had been such a tremendous presence of both the German Communist Party and, of course, the Social Democrats, and prior to the Nazis taking over. And now they had been forced into the underground. And I think that one of the things Boschwitz is doing is reminding us of this class, this great awareness of class struggle. And whether it's so the stereotype is not just the money, the Jewish merchant with his money, but it's this bourgeois. And the word bourgeois, he's called on it a couple times, and even by someone who's helping him out. So I think there's an evocation of that period. It's the same thing we saw in some parts of Darkness at Noon. But I think there is that, and I think Boschwitz is very consciously giving that larger picture and hinting at these leftists. Where did they all go? And some of them wandered into the Nazi camp, and some of them were sent to concentration camps. There is one person in the book who spent a year in a concentration camp, and for being we assume a communist. So I think that there's that motive, and I agree, Adam. Just the ability, and I think what Eva was saying, the author's ability to show this conflict, this psychological conflict within him. And it's not just suddenly I'm a German, but I'm a Jew, but what am I? But it's also an awareness that here I live off money that I properly invested, and that's my livelihood. I can't take that out of a country. And here's a carpenter, and he doesn't need anything. He can get his tools if he gets out of the country, and he can build a new life. But what can I do? And that perspective, suddenly the value of money itself is challenged by making him a merchant in that situation.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things that sort of strikes me about Boschwitz and about the book is how it's hard to sort of pin down. As soon as you start reading it, you think, actually, this isn't terribly predictable. This is a sort of book about, yes, the character's Jewish, but he's not that Jewish. And actually, the tensions between him and some of the other Jews are very interesting. And yes, he's writing about Germany in 38, but he's not really terribly interested in the left. He's not really terribly interested in intellectuals. It's just not what you'd expect a German book about a Jew in Germany in 1938 to be like, I thought.
Well, he's an ordinary Jewish person, thinking of this title, Ordinary Germans. He's one of the ordinary German Jews. He is not extraordinary at all. And, not only is he not a leftist, at some point he's pleased that somebody, I think, was it the person who was taken into concentration camp, that, that somebody from the expropriation party, he calls it.
Yeah.
I don't know, Philip, what for, that seems like a very particular word.
Yeah.
Has got his comeuppance. So, he is not only not a leftist, he's sort of anti-leftist, although, his views change a little bit as the novel goes on.
So there's there's the romantic interlude, which we haven't discussed, and that's another another aspect of the book, adding to the psychological complexity.
And what do you make of that, Philip?
Well, it's again rounding out his character, but also it's what Eva has described as this diving into the personality, the psychology, and his as he takes one train after the other, and as the possibilities of survival seem to be constantly increasingly constricted, he's reaching out, and then he reaches out, and then suddenly he also says, well, my life has changed so utterly. Here, this person meeting this person, well, I could embark on a whole different life. You know, why don't I run away with her? And it's this, there's a bit of fantasizing, and at the same time, there's, I think, relief that here is someone who actually does care for her, you know, expresses some not just mere sympathy, but is willing to offer something to him.
Yeah, I mean, you know, sorry, if I could, yes. I mean, aside from there being a kind of cross-section of Jewish society, there is a cross-section of German society, you know, and she, I mean, aside from, you know, the personal aspect of this encounter, I mean, she is a fully sympathetic German person. She is not somebody who is colluding with the Nazis. You know, but mostly the Germans whom he meets and the Germans whom he knows collude. They're in complete collusion, sometimes out of cowardice. And I actually keep thinking, if I can bring in something else for a moment, I keep thinking of a conversation between Philippe Sands and Hans Frank, who was the son of Otto Frank, the Governor General of Poland under the Nazi regime. And his son became, you know, extremely involved in trying to understand this history. And at some point, a question came to him: why did so many Germans go along with Hitler? And his answer was, it was the lack of civil courage. I thought this was the best answer I'd ever heard. In other words, it was a kind of routine cowardice, and also, you know, then, you know, routine Schadenfreude, routine pleasure at, you know, the Jews getting their comeuppance, but the lack of civil courage. Actually, perhaps we can see it both, you know, in the German characters and in the Jewish characters. There is a complete lack of solidarity, really. So, yeah.
Mm. And one of the other things is about the writing and the quality of the writing, because we've talked a lot about different themes and the psychological complexity of the book. How good a writer is Boschwitz? You know, the book seems to be doing extremely well. It's had a huge impact. Is he, Philip, you've translated Kafka and Koestler. Is he up in that kind of league, or?
Well, that would be perhaps apples and oranges. I mean, one wonders what he might have written had he survived. And this is, you know, he wrote this at a very young age, and he wrote it very quickly. And I think that part of the dynamism of the book, as Eva suggested, does come from the speed with which he wrote it. It's almost embedded in the book. I think he had great promise as a writer. Could we say he's another Kafka? I wouldn't venture that, but I think this is a remarkable. It's a remarkable book considering the circumstances, and also the complexity of that main character, the ability to create a character, excuse me, who is multifaceted, not so sympathetic in this situation at the same time, to give us that snapshot of that situation and the very frightening prescience of some of these passages. I mean, not just the gold star, but there are other ones that are even that are harrowing in what he foresaw. And so that's, I think that's a remarkable feat as a writer, just to be able to capture that. The language, you know, Peter Graf did revise quite a bit. I don't know what the original, I haven't seen the original manuscript, so I don't know the extent of the revisions. And, you know, working with Sarah Burstel and talking about the language on the English level is always fun. And trying to to make sure that we're able to evoke that sense I've referred to earlier as propulsion. So I think it's a successful novel. I don't know if I would rank him yet, but promising certainly. Adam, would you agree?
Oh, absolutely, I agree. But yeah, I'm not sure how useful the comparisons are. I mean, I think this novel is, as you say, in itself just incredibly satisfying to read, probably because of those thriller elements that Eva touched on. And I think it does have a kind of Hitchcockian level to it. And at the same time, being a sort of a Zeitdokument, this makes it just absolutely fascinating and like nothing else. I mean, you mentioned earlier that it doesn't, it's not what we'd expect of a German novel of the period, and I think that might be true. Maybe that's more to do with the fact that we don't really have anything quite comparable to it. As I was saying at the outset, it seems to me that there aren't really any other books quite like this. And we read endlessly, of course, about the war for obvious reasons, but we do read less about this particular period, certainly in fiction, and in fiction from the period, as far as I know, and talking to reading what Peter Graf has read, etc. He doesn't know, there isn't really anything else comparable that are you aware of anything, Philip? I mean, which
No, not quite like this. And certainly not in German. I'm having to think if no, and again, in some ways, there's this odd parallel to Darkness at Noon, written around the same time in response to political events that are happening at that time, and also written very much in haste. So and that book also reads, if you take out the philosophical digressions, there's a bit of a, not quite thriller, but there's a certain noir quality to that book. But I can't think of another one that's like this.
I just wanted, but just before we throw this open to questions from the audience, I just wanted to raise a couple of more general kinds of questions. And one is the rise of small independent publishers with very successful books like this. I think it was in the Critic magazine the other day, somebody wrote a piece about, 6 terrific new books, all of which have been published by different small independent publishers. And I was just wondering, Adam, as an independent publisher, if you had a take on that.
Well, I used to work for Penguin, and as Philip has mentioned, I mean, the American edition is published by Metropolitan Books, which is part of Macmillan and Holtzbrinck, so one of the conglomerates. So I think there's good publishing happening everywhere. At the same time, it is perhaps true, particularly in the UK, there does seem to be a flourishing of small independent publishers, and I think part of that is that the conglomerates are, of course, as they grow bigger and they need to generate more revenue, and they go to kind of more obvious returnable authors, and they're looking for brands and brand names and celebrities. There's a lot of that goes on, and at the same time, we're very lucky in that the book ecosystem that we have at the moment is very well sort of geared towards independent publishers. I mean, Waterstones, ever since James Daunt took over, has really been very supportive of independent publishers like Pushkin. So yeah, I mean, I don't think, I mean, yeah, it's easy. It's a kind of easy narrative to sort of celebrate independent publishers. And as an independent publisher, of course, it's wonderful and I feel flattered, but there's lots of great publishing going on by big publishers. I mean, Eva mentioned Philippe Sands, as his books have both been published by Weidenfeld Nicholson, which is part of Hachette, which is, the second biggest conglomerate. So I don't think there's, no one has a monopoly on good publishing. It's all about how you do it, how much you're committed to it as a publisher and as an editor. I think that's really what it's about. I'm not sure the size of the publisher is the key thing.
And the second thing I wanted to ask about was the amount of translated fiction that there seems to be around these days, which I really don't remember 10, 15 years ago as much. Yes, sort of big names like Günter Grass and Heinrich Böll and stuff, but sort of new names that I'd never heard of, never come across, writing in Polish, German, who are suddenly being translated. And that seems very exciting. Eva, do you have a...
Gosh. Well, I mean, I think, there is a kind of cultural hunger for internationalism. And yes, perhaps in this country in particular after Brexit, but, I'm being entirely speculative. But, this country has become very international, well, very diverse, very internationalized. And there is, I guess, a hunger for this, for, understanding other parts of the world, in our globalized world. I don't know what more can be said. And also, views from other corners of the world. I mean, there was this whole phenomenon which was called the Empire Writes Back. The great popularity of Indian writing in this country. Sort of a curiosity about the other side. But also, it's quite possible that, fiction from these other places, well, it's interesting for being from other places and giving us glimpses of other worlds. It's possible that the state of fiction might be better in those countries. I mean, in other words, they are discovering a lot, and they're discovering a lot through fiction. I am being, I'm just, free associating here. I'm being entirely speculative, but perhaps something like that. Yeah.
I wonder if the percentage of translated books in the UK may be slightly higher than in the US.
It may have gotten a bit higher. I would also say to your point, David, I do think that, publishers tend to follow trends, on the whole. And obviously, so in the popular line, you had the success of Stieg Larsson's books. And then in the more literary line, you had the Elena Ferrante phenomenon. And obviously, publishers took note. I mean, I know that I've been nearly 10 years running Pushkin. And at the beginning, it was pretty easy to acquire literary fiction from other countries. And over the last decade, it has noticeably changed. There is a lot more competition for books. And you can, I've mentioned kind of the most famous examples, but the International Booker Prize, which, is a new thing and only is in its 5th or 6th year now, it's drawn attention to this as well. And some of those books have done extremely well. The first book that won The Vegetarian by Han Kang, was incredibly successful. And then there have been things like Convenience Store Woman from Japan. So I think, again, the more that you have books in translation that do well, the more publishers are going to publish more of them, if that makes sense, on a kind of from a sort of very business-oriented perspective. That's sort of how it works. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. That's one aspect of it, certainly.
It's one of the other things that strikes me is that the more Central and Eastern European fiction one comes across, the less it's what you sort of expect. And I was just reading yesterday about the first translation of Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Eliezer Greenberg and Irving Howe get together in a New York apartment, and Greenberg reads out this story, and Irving Howe goes, wow. And then Greenberg says, but the funny thing is, it's sort of Yiddish, but it's not really kind of Yiddish. And that's what I sort of rather feel about The Passenger, that it's, yes, it's sort of course it's German. Obviously, it's set in Germany, it's by a German, it's about a German. And yet there's something about it. Eva, I think you're absolutely right when you said about an America has a feel of an American film or American pulp fiction or something. I also thought of the Richard Hanna character in the John Buchan novel, The 39 Steps, that it has, you know, the same kind of tremendous compelling feel, and the solitude of the hero and so on. It feels more like that to me than it does like what I'd expect a German novel to be like. But I don't know if perhaps that's just my take on it. I don't know what you all think.
Well, probably German novels today are very different still, if one can generalize about these things. I mean, each work of fiction is very particular, I suppose, but you know, this was written in 1938, so you know, I'm ashamed to say that I don't really know what's going on in German fiction today. I mean, certainly in Polish fiction, there was a great kind of reawakening, you know, after 1989 and after sort of the end of censorship and underground publishing. And there has been amazing fiction coming out of there, including by Olga Tokarczuk, you know, one of the Nobel Prize winners. So yes, so I don't know, but you know, but Boschwitz was also writing from his particular situation, you know, in his particular point of view, and the urgency of it, I think, perhaps was his own urgency as well.
Also, he was multilingual, I think, and he, you know, he studied at the Sorbonne for a little bit, so he was familiar with all sorts of trends, literary trends, I think. And there is a kind of internationalism to the writing, and it's perhaps it's not so much designed for export, but it happens to be easily exportable writing.
Maybe they're also, to your question, I feel like one of the things that's helped the sort of success of fiction translation is that it's people are broadening their idea of what, you know, they expect from certain literature in a way, or literature generally, you know, which is, you know, obviously, as we've discussed, this book was published in 1939 and 1940 in English and didn't, as far as we know, made no impact at all and went out of print and was totally lost. And so I wonder whether it just, not just because of its subject, but its writing, you know, it wasn't really, was it serious, or was it serious enough? And I feel like we've broadened our ideas about literature in lots of ways, and this might be one of them. And it applies to contemporary books as well that are coming from other places, you know, that sometimes they mix fiction and nonfiction in ways that, you know, weren't really accepted just a few years ago, in a sense. And certainly in the English-speaking world, there does seem to be a lot more openness to very different ways of approaching storytelling. And I think this, you know, this maybe fits into that in a way.
It's true, and to your point about the presses and your question earlier, David, I mean, Pyrene Press published Hannah Krall's Chasing the King of Hearts a while back, and that's another book that meets your description, Adam. This kind of reportage style, this very, you know, how are they going to market it? And I think there is more openness to this mix of genres than there used to be. So.
Monica, I'm from your last message that there aren't a lot of questions. When there are, just feel free to leap in and we'll fill those. But in the meantime, we'll just carry on. So, and one of the other things, which I suppose is a sort of slightly obvious point, but reading a novel set in Nazi Germany written before the Holocaust, set before the Holocaust, that adds to the sort of unpredictability of it in a way, or the surprising quality of it, because of course we know what's going to happen in Germany after this period, but it's sort of prescient, as Eva said, but at the same time there's no pre-knowledge of what's going to happen. There's no sort of ironic glimpses into the future, because he didn't know that was going to be the future.
Right.
I have a very specific question, if I may, about the yellow badge. was the color yellow already being associated with Jewish? Was it already a badge of shame, or did he was that just completely invented by him? Do we know?
I think it was a trope that came up earlier.
Right.
Mm.
Okay.
But did that also, Adam, did that come as a sort of surprising aspect of the novel to you?
What you meant, yeah, I think,
And...
well, as I said, I think earlier, I think that kind of, broadly speaking, I prefer reading, when I read about this period, I prefer reading, memoir or nonfiction rather than historical fiction now, because partly to what you said, it just feels like if you try to write a book from the 1930s, the 1940s, you've kind of you're shaping your story because you know what happened and what's going to happen. And that sort of interests me less in a way when it's done in fiction, which is why I found this book, as I say, particularly interesting, the way that it's written before all these events and immediately in response to obviously one particular event and the period from, of the mid late 1930s. So yeah, that for me is absolutely crucial to what makes the novel so interesting and worth reading.
There's another aspect I think that we haven't touched on, but it might be very much to the point, especially given our host AJR, the attempts to escape Germany and the idea that refugees are not welcome elsewhere. They're turned back at the border, and this I think is another resonance that this novel has today, of course, which may explain part of its popularity there. But there is so much talk about escape, getting out of Germany, and all the rigmarole that he has to go through to try and get a visa to do. And of course, we know how difficult that was in hindsight, but he's living it, and he himself had experiences at the Luxembourg border where he was sent back across the border. So the idea that the other countries are not welcoming is another part of this novel, I think, and deserves a mention.
No, I agree with you that that's hugely important, and as you say, that's something that he would have experienced firsthand himself. I mean, my father, my grandfather, and then my father subsequently have held on to all the family letters and documents from this period. I mean, literally every scrap of paper you can imagine.
Wow.
And because so much of it is in German, I've read a lot of it and translated it for my father. And it is, a lot of it is very, it's hard to read, but it is very much to this point that you're talking about, of people desperately trying to find ways to get out of Germany and not being able to, and the kind of waiting for visas. They maybe have a visa coming. They've been told they're going to get a visa, then they don't get the visa. I mean, I've followed this in various letters from both my own family as well as from sort of friends of my grandparents. And yeah, I think that's a hugely important part of the book and captured incredibly well, as you say. But that was clearly real. That was the reality from everything that I know.
That's definitely the reality, yeah.
Because if you compare, for example, with when Hitler stole Pink Rabbit, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and, the family just get on a train and off they go, and it's sort of suddenly they're in Switzerland, and then they're in France, and then they're in Britain. And and because it's from a child's point of view, there's very little about the sheer difficulty of what George Steiner called the dark arts of bureaucracy, just getting those crucial pieces of paper and how you get across borders and so on. Whereas this book is full of how difficult it is to just get away, get out. And who do you take with you? Does he take his non-Jewish wife? Does he just rush for the border on his own? Does he? Because on the one hand, constantly saying how alone he feels, and yet he keeps having these significant encounters with people, which are fascinating throughout the book.
There's also no time for planning or reflection because the events are happening. So it's moving target all the time, and he's reacting. The moment he starts to plan something, already the situation has changed, and that's something also that's part of the movement in the book, I think, and that logistical nightmare is part of that because it's like the passengers on the St. Louis. Issued landing permits, and then a few days at sea, the landing permits are declared invalid. So it's that whole.
Yeah, I mean, the related to this, you mentioned children, of course. I mean, there might be even people watching tonight. I mean, with the Kindertransport, which we obviously celebrate rightly in Britain, but at the same time, we often don't talk about the parents who, you know, sometimes we're able to come, often we're not. It's a complicated, quite difficult area, isn't it?
David, I wonder if I might come in because there are indeed addressed just to me, so you can't see them, a whole number of questions. Perhaps I could just start the ball rolling by adding to this important issue of, the closed borders, the lack of options, but also something that isn't there in the book, but which is part of the author's story, and that is the atrocious way in which he and so many of his fellow Jewish or Austrian, Austrian or German refugees were treated by the British government. I mean, the whole internment episode is actually intensely murky, and one that I find increasingly fascinating. This year this year, the 80th anniversary of that episode. The Dunera, to which Philip briefly alluded, was the most appalling business. I mustn't go into detail here, but so there is that added dimension in the biography of the author that actually even the host country, yes, it bears closer scrutiny. It's not a simple or an entirely benign story. Quite a lot of comments about, or sort of questions about other books to which one might compare it. I think we had one or two mentioned, but the Oppermanns by Furchtwanger comes to mind. Certainly, these are books that were written at the time and thereby have that ring of terrible authenticity. I'm also aware of Vesa Canetti's far too little known book, The Tortoises. Somebody's mentioned Suite Française by Irene Nemirovsky. I must confess, remember exactly when that was authored. So I wonder whether, you would like to kind of compare and contrast a little bit on that front.
Knowing smiles from everybody.
Yeah.
Are we putting you on the spot?
Actually, just to get the ball rolling, one thing I would compare it with is actually not another novel, but is a film, the expressionist classic M with Peter Lorre. Somebody else, solitary, on the run, being chased. And it just has that similar sort of dark, increasingly claustrophobic feel, I thought. But
I wondered also, I mean, apropos that, whether that kind of thriller quality, you mentioned Pulp Fiction even, David, whether it's partly to do with his very young age at the time he was writing. I mean, this is a writer in the making, isn't it? And perhaps his cultural milieu was actually very different to Kafka or some of the other people one might compare him to. That's just a thought I had. I wonder. And that's certainly what makes it very accessible, I think, to audiences now, isn't it? It is, on one level, a very good read. It's easy to get,
Philip, remind us how old he was when he wrote this?
Was he 23? 23, I think. 23, 24, 23.
Yeah.
Yes.
He was only 27, I think, when he was drowned.
He was drowned, right. He was 27 when he died. And
Yeah.
so he was the same age as Georg Büchner when Büchner, he basically.
Because Eva, I think it was you who said about American fiction, American films, and the sort of influence that might have had on him, or the sort of relationship he might have had with that.
Yes, and as I said, I quickly confessed that I actually don't read thrillers very much. I mean, I suppose I was thinking of Casablanca and, you know, other, or not only Citizen Kane recently, but, you know, but Humphrey Bogart, you know. But have I read American, can I mention particular American thrillers? I'm afraid not. It just, you know, it does have that quality.
I think that's partly the prose is very easy to read. You keep turning the pages very, very quickly. You want to find out what's going to happen.
Yeah. Yes, it's interesting because, you know, you want to find out what's going to happen. And so it's simultaneously very propellant and very static, you know. He is stuck in this situation and eventually he really gets stuck and eventually, you know, he even contemplates jumping under a train. So it's kind of, you know, it's in a sense a kind of completely fruitless movement. You know, movement which doesn't take him anywhere except, you know, further and further into his own sort of self-division and, you know, terrible states which come closer and closer to insanity. So.
And yet there's always the possibility that the money will come through, suddenly he'll have the money, he might be able to get away. You just don't know until, you know, what will happen. So you keep turning the pages to find out, will he actually make it against all the odds? And
I think an underrated literary influence may also be the newspapers, because I think people read so much more, and we even have Otto Silbermann talking about reading newspapers, but I think Boschwitz was probably reading newspapers in different languages. And I think the style, the journalistic style, and the number of journalists who also wrote larger prose pieces, and a lot of those journalists from those days also in the States, you know, became rather famous for their books, right? So I think that there is something of the journalistic influence, and we could probably look to some of the writers of feuilletons in the Frankfurt Zeitung and others that he probably read, and sometimes
it would have been the only way he was getting his information about what was happening in Germany.
Right.
After all, he would have been reading the papers in, you know, in Scandinavia, and I think you're right, Philip, that was a big
pace of the journalistic, you know, that type of journalism, which I think also Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler also have that aspect.
May I ask, what do we know about his other writings? There was another novel, I do believe. Is that right? I mean, how much other evidence do we have of his writing ability and, you know, his output?
There was a novel that has not, I don't think, been translated into English. I used the title "People Parallel to Life," but Adam, do you know?
I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
I haven't read it.
Yes, that's the rough translation. Yeah, I have recently received it, but I haven't had a chance to read it actually.
And Philip, when you were translating this, did you go back to the original 1940 English translation?
No, I've never seen it. No. I wouldn't want to, even if I had it, but even if I could have gotten hold of it, I wouldn't. And I think there were so many emendations to this version. I think that Peter Graf really did quite a lot. I'm guessing he did quite a lot of work.
Do you know what kind of work? Because there's a reference in the preface to revisions.
Apparently, Boschwitz had written his mother. He hoped that she might find someone of a literary background to kind of shepherd the book into print, and so decades later, that person wound up being Peter Graf in the German edition.
Can you tell us what the revisions were, more or less, because that actually would throw quite a bit of light on what he was trying to do, and then what he was trying to do perhaps more self-consciously later when, you know, when he wasn't writing in such a terrific hurry.
I'm not sure I understood the first part of the question.
What did he want to revise? What?
We don't know exactly what. I think he felt he had written something very quickly, and it was like a first draft that got published, and then he wanted to. That's all I can deduce from it, because we have no evidence other than what Peter Graf might have seen in the original manuscript in German. There might have been some markings, or I don't, but I can't answer that.
One of the other interesting things I think about the novel is the number of references to the First World War. He was a First World War veteran. His colleague, fellow owner of the company, Becker, that's where they went back to. They knew each other on the Western Front, and that's also adds a sort of different flavour to the book. I think this sort of interest in that particular sort of moment and time.
No, I think that's actually quite significant. He feels very German, you know. He's Jewish, and you know he doesn't hide it as some people did, but he is very German, and he is attached to German culture. And in a sense, I was thinking a little bit about the very different sort of, you know, position of Jews in Germany and Jews in Poland. You know, Jews in Poland, I mean, you know, there are various relationships between Jews and Poles through the ages, and they weren't always awful by any means. But the Jews of Poland absolutely knew that they were Jewish. You know, that I mean, in other words, being, you know, Polish and Jewish was a rather exceptional a kind of identity to take on. So, I mean, I think, yes, you know, he was a patriot. He is a patriot. He's nostalgic for the war. He wants to tell people about it. Now, mind you, he's nostalgic for the war because that was a time of solidarity. And I honestly think that that's, you know, quite an important motif. You know, he is being betrayed from right and left, but, you know, there is no solidarity from anywhere. And, you know, there isn't that much solidarity on his part, although it varies, with other Jewish characters. So there is a kind of lack of that altogether.
But he was not only in the war, but he was also decorated in some fashion, and he was of a higher rank, and that sets him apart, and that also echoes the class difference that is a theme through the book.
Another thing we haven't really touched on is, you know, and I think it relates to the whole book too, is why is he still there at this late date as well, you know, which always comes up. And I think, you know, he obviously had the means and probably could have left earlier, like Boschwitz. And I think it's interesting the way that it so fits into his psychology that he doesn't really think of himself as, you know, his main identity is as a German, and that's why he's still there. And it's all coming as quite a surprise to him from the beginning of the book, and from the bits that Philip read. I think it's a really important aspect.
And that wake-up call was Kristallnacht, as for so many, and that is actually the beginning of this book. It's like, boom.
Yeah.
Perhaps I can just give you a few more questions here. An astute comment from Jacqueline. Is it Jacqueline? I think so. Commenting that just because he's so relatively unsympathetic, as you yourselves have commented, Boschwitz lays bare the awful persecution without leading the reader by the nose by using a sympathetic protagonist. I think that's certainly an important point, isn't it? Indeed. A question about the book covers, shifting the focus somewhat. Why do you need two different ones for America and for England?
I mean, there's no good reason. Sometimes they're the same. I think it's, to be honest, I hadn't seen the American cover when we developed this cover, and actually we used an illustration done for the Spanish edition, which we had seen and really liked. So I obviously, as the Americans did when I was choosing the cover for our edition, there was the German edition, and the German edition has a kind of photograph of a train station from the 1930s, and there were various other editions. And then I saw this illustration for the forthcoming Spanish edition, and I thought it was very powerful. Yeah, I liked it a lot. Though it's worth noting, we had to remove the swastikas, of course, for the export edition that is sold outside of the UK. So the swastikas of the banners are not.
And this edition is this print by Franz Masereel that Sarah had published earlier, and it fits so perfectly that she just remembered it. And
we also have a very specific question about the quotation on the front cover of the English edition. Yes, remarkable, disabused, prophetic and flawlessly penetrating. And the questioner was wondering about that word disabused, which is actually quite a curious term to use. Wondered if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Well, I mean, I think one aspect of that is precisely not making the protagonist a completely sympathetic character. I mean, it's disabused about human nature, I suppose. It's disabused about. It's not that there really aren't glimmerings of idealism in it, which would cut through what we see.
Because one word we haven't used yet is unsentimental. And one of the really delightful things about the book is that it is so unsentimental. There's no false kind of emotion in it anywhere at all. And that is really refreshing and interesting, I think.
Apropos that, I actually have two related comments, one from Paul Cousteau, a student and educator of children about the Holocaust. I and my colleagues are more than skeptical about novels like The Boy in Striped Pyjamas, for example, because of the historical inaccuracy and many other things one might comment on. The Passenger is not of the same ilk, and I would welcome more of this sort of literature, which I could carry on, but I think that gives the gist of that comment. And then also, well, to all of you really, but is there any, or actually probably you Adam, what evidence, if any, is there that books like The Passenger are being read in schools today or by young adults?
Well, I actually, the best evidence I can give is what happened with Alone in Berlin, which I mentioned earlier. After we published it, and it was so, it had a similar kind of reception in a way, I then heard from people that it was being read at GCSE level and A level in English schools, and I still hear that today sometimes, that people tell me, oh, my son or daughter is reading Alone in Berlin. And I think that's kind of what happens over time naturally. So I can imagine The Passenger having a similar, in the next 5 to 10 years, I can imagine that happening as well. Because I think more and more curricula are changing, rather than just reading the same book for 50 years, people are looking to kind of read something different. So yeah, that's all I would say to that.
I'm put in mind of the Fred Ullman novella called Reunion, which was a surprise bestseller, again, deceptively simple, and yet, and very readable, and yes, for young people, indeed. David, do you think we ought to, it is now 15:15, I don't know whether you want to round things off yourself, or shall we?
Go ahead, Monica, go ahead.
No. Any last chance to ask any questions? There are a few specific ones, which I think have actually been covered more or less by the wonderfully freewheeling discussion. So yes, perhaps I should indeed round things off, of course, first of all, by saying a very big thank you to our 4 participants. As I mentioned earlier, the event has been recorded and will be uploaded within a week or so onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, and also the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees YouTube channel. If you don't know about Insiders Outsiders, I would urge you to look at the website, insidersoutsiders.org, and particularly at the section What's On, which will tell you what's coming up in the next 2 weeks and indeed beyond. One important thing I failed to mention, and I'm just looking, there is one more question coming in, just a thank you, there you are, fine, is that Pushkin Press has kindly arranged for there to be a 20% discount on the cover price of the book for those of you, and I suspect there are quite a few who very much want to go away and read it now. The discount code is very simple, insiders with a small I, 20, which you simply type in at the checkout on the Pushkin Press website. I'd also just like to say, if I may, that apropos the Dunera and that whole experience of internment or sort of deportation, in a sense it was deportation by the British government of so-called enemy aliens to Australia. Insiders Outsiders is actually planning a whole cluster of events to do with that Australian side of things in early October. So it hasn't been announced yet, but it's being hatched as we speak. So you might like to look out for that. And indeed, for those of you who would like to know what's brewing in the future, if you sign up to the newsletter on any page, bottom right of the Insiders Outsiders Festival website, that is the way to be kept informed. Talking about the obstacles, the kind of minutiae of trying to get out, I should perhaps alert you to the fact that tomorrow evening is the next event in line for us, again in association with the AJR, is a talk about Julia Neuberger's mother, Liesl Alice Schwab, a book about her that's just come out by Joachim Schleur, and that should also, I think, tie in very interesting and you know, sort of personal ways with some of the things that we've been talking about. Good, so thank you very much, everyone. Be well, and I look forward to seeing you perhaps at other events, and thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for having me.
Goodbye.